Good afternoon. I'm Rollie Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia that does research on international affairs and national security. This afternoon is a very special occasion. It's the official launch event of our new China Center, and we're really excited that we have Laura Rosenberger from the NSC with us today. I'll talk a little bit more about her in a moment, but I want to say a couple words about the China Center. This, as many of you know, is a new initiative for us. We're very excited about it. And the new China Center is going to focus on the geoeconomics of China, not only in the Asian region, but around the world. It's strategic behavior, China's strategic behavior, technology, and China's actions in the area of technology, as well as military domains. So I encourage you to visit our website, and where we have a lot of information on the new China Center, as well as an opportunity to subscribe to our newsletter, our China newsletter. So let me say a few words about Laura Rosenberger. She's going to be talking today with me about U.S. strategy towards China, and her title is Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for China and Taiwan on the National Security Council at the White House. She develops and helps lead execution of U.S.-China strategy. She also served as former director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy. She was a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And prior to that, she was a foreign policy advisor for the Hillary for America organization, and also served for over a decade in a range of positions at State Department and the National Security Council. Laura, really thrilled to have you today. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to open our conversation very broadly and talk about the U.S. strategy for China, as well as the Indo-Pacific strategy, which I understand was just released on Friday. So Laura, can you just paint a broad view of what these strategies are, what the goals of them are, or what the pillars of them are, and perhaps how they differ from the past?
Sure, absolutely. Well, Rollie, first of all, thank you to the FPRI for having me today. Really great to be with all of you, and congratulations on the launch of the new China Center. Such an important area for increasing knowledge and research, and our depth of talent, and the bench of folks who are looking at these issues. So really grateful for all that you're doing to invest in the future of both our knowledge and expertise and the talent that we have on these issues. So thanks and congrats for that. On our China strategy, I'll speak to a couple of different pieces of this. I mean, the administration's sort of basic objectives with respect to China are looking at the fact that China essentially has the will and the wherewithal to advance a different vision for the future world order, and to be able to really take a desire to take a leadership edge across numerous different domains in the military, political, economic, technological, really to challenge U.S. leadership and the leadership of our allies and partners. We believe it's incredibly important for the United States, along with our allies and partners, to maintain a favorable balance of shaping power and influence in order to continue to write the rules of the 21st century in a way that's consistent with our interests and our values. And so our China strategy really flows from that. It involves a recognition of the fact that we have a very limited ability to change China. But therefore, the bulk of our focus is where we actually think we have a lot of power to shape things, which is the strategic environment around China. And we're doing that through a number of different pillars. The first is investing in ourselves at home, really strengthening our own competitive hand. I'm a big football fan, and so one of the things that I'm always mindful of is, for any good football team, no matter how good your defense is, you need an offense. And so for me, really the investing in ourselves piece of this is about having that offensive game, that strongest competitive hand. And I'm happy to speak to some of what we've been doing on that front in a moment. But we also, recognize another one of the greatest sources of American strength is our network of allies and partners, really a unique strategic asset for the United States. And frankly, you asked, how our strategy differs from previous ones. I would say certainly, the last administration, I think, really neglected our allies and partners in a number of ways. And frankly, actually, in some ways was sort of at odds with them on key fronts, including on the trade front, when we probably should have been seeking greater alignment with them to deal with the China challenge. And so for the United States and for the Biden administration, we really see aligning with our allies and partners on key initiatives in order to build collective resilience, close off vulnerabilities, put forward a shared affirmative approach. This isn't necessarily about or even really about building some sort of counter-China coalition. That's, I think, sort of a misunderstanding of what it is that we're seeking to do. Certainly there are elements where we need to push back on China's worst abuses, but a lot of what we're trying to do through the configurations that we're putting together, connecting allies and partners in new and different ways, is really about that affirmative vision for the future. And by investing in ourselves and aligning with allies and partners, we believe that gives us what we need in order to do really leads to the third pillar of our strategy, which is to outcompete China. To outcompete China across the full range of the domains in which the competition is playing out. Some of that involves the defensive game, right? We talked about the offensive side of the ball, but the defensive side of the ball comes into play here, and certainly taking steps to protect our national security, taking steps to uphold our interests and our values, including in the face of China's human rights abuses, but to, at the same time, manage that competition responsibly by putting in place guardrails for the competition, by making sure that we don't sort of see uncontrolled escalatory spirals, and frankly, holding open the prospect and attempting to work together where our interests align, especially on key challenges like climate change and health security and non-proliferation, where these are existential global issues. It's not about doing a favor to any one country. It's really about what nations who want to lead. It's what they should do. Those are really the key elements of our China strategy at a very broad level. And as I said, happy to dig in more specifics to what we're doing on each of those. You also asked about our Indo-Pacific strategy, and thanks for asking about that. And you're right, we did release that on Friday as Secretary Blinken was out in the region. Actually, he was in Fiji in the middle of the Pacific appropriately when we released this document. And the Indo-Pacific strategy is really about an affirmative vision for what a free and Indo-Pacific region looks like. What the United States, along with our allies and partners, needs to do to uphold the principles that we believe should underpin such a region, and the steps that we're going to take in order to realize it. Now, it's obviously against the backdrop of the challenge from China and the very different kind of vision that we believe China has for the region, including things like a sphere of influence, which we certainly reject. But these two these two strategies are kind of complementary to each other in that way. Our China strategy is global. It recognizes that the challenge we face from China, as I mentioned, is not only cross-domain, but crosses all regions, but certainly is playing out in probably the most intense ways in the Indo-Pacific region. And so really, again, this is our articulation of our affirmative vision for that region in the face of the China challenge.
Thanks, Laura. That certainly is an ambitious program. One question I would like to ask is the Biden administration has just passed the 1-year point, and can you talk about some of the progress you've made on the China strategy? Are there any specific accomplishments, tangible accomplishments beyond having meetings, talking about frameworks, summitry and such? Any tangible, specific progress or accomplishments, and what grade would you give yourselves?
I think the last part's an unfair question, but I will.
Okay. I'll rephrase. Can you comment on that?
You can grade me, but certainly I'm happy to speak to some of the concrete pieces. And again, I think it really starts from this recognition that a lot of this is about the strategic environment around China, right? And how do we shape that to our advantage and to a way that builds resilience and gives us the strongest hand? So I'll start with investments, and everything, frankly, from COVID-19 recovery at home, getting vaccines out the door. When we think back a year ago where we were, just really beginning to get a vaccination program underway in the United States, The major economic recovery package that was passed very early on in this administration, the bipartisan infrastructure framework that was passed, in 2021. Again, obviously, on its face, may not seem actually like an element about China, but in fact, actually, if we can't get our own infrastructure in order, and if we can't be investing in ourselves in that way, we're going to get left behind in this competition. The Congress also has passed, the Senate passed the USICA package, the House passed the Competes Act, and they're now headed for a conference. There's key elements in each of those packages, that we think will also further our ability to compete successfully with China by investing in ourselves, funding for semiconductor investments in particular, the CHIPS Act, a number of other competitive elements in there that we think are really important to really investing here in ourselves at home. So just a few things to point to on that pillar. On the aligning with allies piece, I think there's a huge amount to point to there, but I'll sort of maybe point to a couple of highlights, in particular, as you said, on sort of the concrete front. Several elements with Europe in terms of transatlantic unity, and obviously a lot of the focus right now and conversation that we're having across the transatlantic space is focused on the Russia challenge. But we've also had significant conversations about the China challenge, and the Secretary General of NATO just today even talked about how the Russia and China challenges relate to one another with the alignment that we're seeing between Putin and Xi Jinping. But in terms of concrete steps that we've taken with one another, the United States and EU last fall resolved the 232 tariff dispute, which really we did so in the context of reaching an agreement that not only removes the tariffs, but allows us to focus on how we keep sort of dirty steel and aluminum, which by and large comes from China, is often advanced through unfair trade and economic practices, in order to be able to focus on having cleaner and steel and aluminum that's made through, or sort of that's distributed through more fair trade and economic practices. We also resolved the Boeing Airbus dispute, which had been a 17-year running irritant between the United States and Europe. Again, focusing on deciding that we wanted to address the gap between us in order to focus the challenge on the greater unfair practices that we see from China. We've seen an agreement between the G7 to remove products made with forced labor from our supply chains, and I think that's something that we want to continue to work on this year. We've seen also on the economic coercion front, in the face of China taking very aggressive coercive actions against Australia, Lithuania. Most recently, the EU brought a WTO case just a couple weeks ago against China, and a number of countries, including the United States, UK, and Australia, have announced an intention to join consultations on that case. So you see a coming together around some of these very specific things. That was a number of points on the European front, which I think is important just to highlight against the backdrop of the Indo-Pacific piece we just talked about. But of course, in the Indo-Pacific, we're also heavily investing there. We've got the Quad that met twice last year at the leader level, both at the virtually first early in the year, and then in person later in the year, where there's a vaccine initiative that is, again, really about sort of what can we do affirmatively to get more vaccines out to the world, using a cooperative mechanism amongst the group. We're working together on cyber and technology. We're working together on a number of different fronts. There's the AUKUS initiative, obviously bringing together an ally in Europe and an ally in the Pacific, in a framework around security issues. So many other things I could point to there, but I'll kind of I think probably leave it there. And then I guess the last piece on the competitive side, that with China, we've obviously taken a number of steps over the past year that are aimed at continuing to protect our national security, and whether that's some new EO frameworks, some of which build on steps taken by the last administration, but make them a bit more sustainable, and in some cases actually add an element of concern about protecting our values around things like the export of surveillance technology. How do we ensure that we are not investing in those sorts of things, and making sure that Americans' data is protected? All these kinds of measures are steps that that we've been taking, along with continuing to ensure that, when there's a need for, addressing export control violations or anything like that, that we're addressing all those sort of on an ongoing basis. And then last point that I would point to here is on the question of sort of managing the competition responsibly. President Biden and President Xi spoke with one another 3 times last year. The last most recent time was in November in a virtual meeting on Zoom for 3.5 hours, where they talked about a number of areas where we're continuing to follow up, including to make sure we have ways to address strategic risk in the relationship. So I think there's been a good bit of work over the past year. Certainly a lot of unfinished business, which is what the next few years are really about, making sure that we are on an accelerated basis taking steps to advance each of these elements of our strategy.
Okay, thank you. I understand the administration early on did a 100-day review of supply chains in pharmaceuticals, semiconductor, high-capacity battery, critical mineral and strategic minerals supply chains. So 100 days is well past. Were there any important outcomes from that survey and any action taken?
Yeah, this is obviously a really important element of the work that we're doing. And, the 100-day reports published in June on the 100-day mark sort of lay out a series of recommendations, which we are implementing. That includes working to bring back manufacturing to America and secure those critical supply chains. And since the beginning of this administration, about $80 billion in new semiconductor investments have been announced, which is obviously one of the key elements of the supply chain. I understand that next week the 1-year reports are going to be published on the 1-year anniversary, and we will continue our work really on implementing the recommendations around these 4 key areas of critical products that you noted: the semiconductor manufacturing and advanced packaging, large capacity batteries like those for electric vehicles. And anybody watching the Super Bowl and the number of commercials on electric vehicles knows how much this is really the technology of the future. Critical minerals and materials, which underpin so much of this, as well as pharmaceuticals and active pharmaceutical ingredients. So again, continuing ongoing work really to make sure that we are investing and focusing on how we have our supply chains both secure, and that we are really allowing the work to bring manufacturing back to America.
Thank you. One of the things you talked a lot about was rekindling our relationships with key allies, and that was certainly part of the Biden presidential campaign as well. I'd like to ask you, again, if you could comment on the TPP, because as you know, the Trump administration backed away from that, which was, of course, an Obama administration initiative. And as I know you're aware, many of our allies were very concerned about us backing away from that. In fact, in their view, it gave China an upper hand in the region, and their RCEP trade agreement has important allies of ours who are members of it: Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, just to name a few. Can you comment on TPP? And again, I would say that a lot of the reason why there was a backing away from it were for domestic political reasons, not necessarily having to do with trade in the region. And I'm just, again, quoting what's out there. So I think it's an important topic, and I'd appreciate your comment on it.
Sure. Well, thanks, Rollie. I think there is no question that the United States believes that it's absolutely critical for us to be engaged with partners in the Indo-Pacific region, specifically on economic issues. And I think there's going to be a number of ways in which the rules of the road and of the sort of future connectivity of the region, as well as the competitiveness, is going to be defined by how well countries are able to harness technology and digital sectors, the coming energy and climate transitions. These will all, provide sort of broadly shared shared, inclusive growth for people if we're able to sort of harness them in the right way. The Biden administration, President Biden actually last fall announced at the East Asia Summit that the United States is working to develop an Indo-Pacific economic framework. And we're doing so in consultations with our allies and partners in the region to position our economies for the future. This framework, the one that we are developing, will for us be the centerpiece of our economic strategy in the Indo-Pacific and will complement our national security goals with the region. We really believe that this framework will allow us to strengthen our economic ties with the region itself, to improve connectivity and to boost our economic prosperity. The framework that we envision will address a range of important economic issues in areas of cooperation, including fair and resilient trade, digital and emerging technology, supply chain resilience, infrastructure, decarbonization and clean energy, and tax and anti-corruption. And so, from our perspective, this is a way for, that we believe we can be deeply embedded with the region on the economic front, while also ensuring, that we are, upholding the president's commitment to protect American workers as well.
Thank you. I would like to drill down a little bit on your the first pillar, which was investing in the U.S. and in particular in the area of technology, semiconductors. I know there have been plans announced to build semiconductor facilities in the United States, a handful. But again, in high technology, the competition with China, in fact, some of our NATO partners have looked at using Chinese equipment in their sensitive, defense related materials. Can you comment on where are we in, again, investing in the US to get us competitive and catch up to where China has gotten?
Well, thanks. Yeah, as you noted, it's unbelievably critical, and we've got to be able to make sure that we actually have the capacity to be producing the kinds of high-end technologies for the future, and to be doing so in ways that will allow us not only to maintain competitiveness, but to do so in a way that's resilient. And it harkens back to the supply chain conversation as well, to make sure that those supply chains are secure and flowing. And I think, as most listeners probably, or viewers probably know, there's been actually a semiconductor shortage that's been, really prompted by a range of different factors, including the fact that we're all using, digital technologies and home computing and other sorts of things in many different ways in the past few years during the pandemic. But it's really underscored, I think, the importance of these technologies for so much of what we do in our daily lives. You rightly point to the fact that, this is a conversation also with our allies, where it's important that we focus on how we use technologies that are secure and in ways that, where even as we're investing in ourselves, that we're doing so in ways that is complementary with our allies and partners. The legislation that I referenced earlier, some of which is still pending in Congress, will, I think, enable us to continue that investment. The CHIPS Act was a really good step, and the funding that we hope will follow will really, I think, be an important additional step forward in order to really continue to work with those investments. But you noted, of course, some of the investments that some of our partners have announced here in the United States. Taiwan's TSMC, which is really producing leading edge semiconductors, has announced the building of some fabs in Arizona. These are the kinds of things that we think are incredibly important to continue to build on, and one where we continue to put a lot of focus, again, working very closely with our allies.
Continuing on the defense theme, we've seen a much more provocative China over the last decade, and we've seen border skirmishes with India, incursions in the air defense identification zone, violations against Taiwan, maritime militia clashes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Can you comment on what's the U.S. strategy to deal with this and deter these kinds of conflicts, especially those that touch on some of our very close allies?
Yeah, obviously, we're watching very closely all the actions that China's taking in the region, including many of which are in the gray zone, as we call it. The United States, I think, puts a real importance on maintaining deterrence in the region, in particular in the Western Pacific and across the Taiwan Strait. I think you've seen, whether it's in our own some of the statements with our allies and partners that have been focused on deterrence issues, as well as ways that we're reinforcing our own presence and posture in the region, that we believe are really important means to continue to reinforce deterrence. But we also, are quite clear with China about our concerns about the activities that it's undertaking, many of which you named. But some of this is also really about, in addition to what we ourselves are doing and the concerns that we're raising directly with Beijing, it's really about reinforcing the resilience and capacity of our allies and partners. And you've seen over the past year, for instance, a number of steps that we've taken with the Philippines, one of our treaty allies in the region, some continuing important steps building on the long history that we have with the Philippines. I think, we've taken a number of steps with others in the region, including, on the non-military side. I think one of the things that's important from our perspective, and certainly Secretary Austin has talked about this, is this concept of integrated deterrence, that especially when we're dealing with the kinds of gray zone activities that we see from Beijing in many areas, that we can't just think about the military tool in isolation, that we really need to think from a sort of whole of government approach. What are the range of tools that we can bring together in order to build resilience, close off vulnerabilities, build capacity, and reinforce deterrence from a number of different perspectives. This is an ongoing effort, and the steps that we've taken, including through announcing AUKUS, I think is a really key step in terms of buttressing deterrence in the region and building capabilities, not only with our Australian ally, but increasingly embedding, the UK in the security of the region. And I think we're going to continue to develop those steps. The last point I would say is more specific to the cross-strait deterrence questions, where I think it's really important to underscore that, the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and ensuring that there is no unilateral change to the status quo is something that's important not just for the United States and not just for Taiwan, but that is important to a number of other countries around the world. Taiwan plays a critical role in the semiconductor supply chains, as we just discussed. It's one of the United States' largest trading partners, thriving democracy in the region. And I think that's why you've seen a number of countries, for the first time in really unprecedented ways, making statements publicly about the importance of deterrence, maintaining deterrence across the strait, upholding peace and stability. You saw this in a statement from Prime Minister Suga last year when he visited the White House, when he was the Japanese Prime Minister. South Korean President Moon Jae-in also used some similar language when he visited the White House. We've seen this in statements with some of our European allies and partners. And so I think, again, to the extent that there is deterrent signaling happening from a range of capitals, I think you actually see more and more voices coming to the table to underscore the broad-based concerns and interest in maintaining peace and stability across the strait.
Thank you. Besides being militarily provocative, the Chinese have also engaged in economic coercion. Can you talk a little bit about where we've seen that and what we as the United States are doing about it?
Absolutely. It's another one of these tactics that we see Beijing increasingly employing. Beijing has a long history of taking some of these steps. I think, the egregiousness has brought it into focus much more recently, but you could even go back to some coercive measures that Beijing put in place against Norway after the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded over a decade ago to a Chinese dissident, Liu Xiaobo, where Beijing blocked the sale of Norwegian salmon and a number of other things. And that's just one of many examples going back in time. But certainly more recently, you've seen these tactics get even more assertive. After Australia in 2020, called for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Beijing, really launched essentially sort of an undeclared, trade war against Australia on a wide range of products. But in many ways, I think the result that had is somewhat counterproductive, where actually you've seen Australia take a number of steps to actually reduce dependence on China, reroute some of its supply chains, build resilience, and take steps to deal with the China challenge. More recently, the coercive economic tactics from Beijing have been particularly trained on Lithuania in the wake of Lithuania opening what they've called a Taiwanese representative office. Beijing has again really taken a number of coercive economic steps against Lithuania, and I think employed a tactic that they thought, Beijing has tried numerous times, not dissimilar to something we see from Moscow, of trying to split allies, and in this case, I think kind of create divisions within Europe by saying not only are we not going to take imports from Lithuania, but German cars that have Lithuanian components, we're not going to allow those to be imported either. I think hoping that they were going to essentially force other European governments to kind of calm down on Lithuania. And in fact, again, what we've seen has been the opposite, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the EU just a few weeks ago bringing a WTO case against China for these coercive activities, and then other countries seeking to join those consultations. And obviously, I think in this context, the question of EU solidarity is really important. But the United States has been standing very closely with Lithuania and the EU in the face of these coercive activities. Having a number of conversations and taking some concrete measures to, reinforce Lithuania economically, take some steps to be able to increase imports from Lithuania to the United States, and help kind of think through how to deal with these broader challenges. There's been a number of conversations in Brussels about a broader economic coercion mechanism that the EU is considering, we think that there's a lot of opportunity here for the United States, Europe, Australia, other countries to be able to think through and brainstorm, how can we collectively ensure that we are building resilience with one another, closing off vulnerabilities, and have a way to step in to support one another in the face of these kinds of tactics from Beijing to essentially show over time that, in fact, they're not only not effective, but counterproductive. And I think that would be the goal. And I think certainly if we look at some of the cases that I just talked through, that's how we see some of these measures playing out. And I think that that's our goal, is to, over time, continue to reinforce that.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. I'm going to turn to some of the questions we have that have come in from the audience. So the first one is a question about expanding the Quad. The question goes, over the past year, the administration has worked very hard to expand cooperation between the members of the Quad on critical issues such as vaccine distribution, climate change, and supply chain resilience. Moving forward, what role do you envision the Quad playing in the region? Do you see a potential for the partnership to expand to include other countries, even if only on an issue-specific basis?
Well, I love the question, and I love that whoever asked it is paying such close attention to all the many good things we're doing for the Quad, like a spokesperson for what we're doing. So thank you for that. We believe, from the Quad perspective, that the Quad's very interested in finding ways to work with like-minded partners, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think to that end, the Quad's most interested in finding ways to partner and work more collaboratively with ASEAN countries. We think there is tremendous opportunity there. Obviously, the Quad Vaccine Initiative was focused in particular on ASEAN, but there's many opportunities to continue to build on that. I think the question noted, the possibility of working together on specific issues with additional partners, and that is very much how the Quad is thinking about this. There's no current plans to formally expand the Quad, but we absolutely believe that there's tremendous opportunity to work with other allies and partners on specific issues that are on the Quad agenda.
Thank you. Another question on economic decoupling. What is the administration's long-term vision for the U.S.-China trade relationship? Does the administration intend to pursue wholesale economic decoupling, or will it seek to promote trade and investment with China in non-sensitive sectors?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think what I might do is actually reframe it just a bit, because from where we sit, we actually see that it's Beijing that is really looking essentially to reduce its dependence on the rest of the world. A number of the policies that Beijing has announced and is pursuing are really aimed at indigenizing its own capacities and really in many ways creating, closing off in some ways some of the linkages with other parts of the world on some of these key technologies. And I think at the same time that Beijing's seeking to reduce its own dependence on others, we see a potential desire by Beijing to increase dependence by the rest of the world on China. And, for a variety of reasons, including what we just talked about with economic coercion and how we see, the way that Beijing sort of weaponizes that kind of dependence, we certainly have concerns about about the idea of the United States or others becoming more dependent on China. So in many ways, we actually think that it's the driving force on where we see there being differences in how we're pursuing technology and economics and trade across the Pacific. A lot of that's really being driven from our perspective by Beijing. The measures that the United States is taking are really aimed at protecting our national security. We see a number of ways in which Beijing uses things like its military civil fusion program and other ways that it is, stealing technology, forced tech transfer, other kinds of measures that are really aimed at undermining our national security and providing certain kinds of technologies for military advantage to Beijing. We're really focused on those pieces and protecting those kinds of technologies and ensuring that the United States, can maintain its military advantage and isn't inadvertently fueling the military advantage that Beijing is seeking. And as I mentioned earlier, we are also taking steps to protect our values in the technology space. We see Beijing seeking not only to export certain kinds of surveillance technology, which are used, not only domestically for human rights abuses, but also for, potential repression in other countries. And we think this is, in part about, a question of who gets to write the rules or who will prevail in writing the rules for how technology is used in the 21st century. And we do believe that, there are ways in which the United States can and should take steps to ensure that technologies are being used in a way that's consistent with the values that we seek. And again, that's why certainly in one of the executive orders that the Biden administration put forward last year, that we focus on those kinds of things. But, I think there's also, a range of areas in which the United States and China have a very deep economic and trade relationship. And, certainly, we know that there's benefit to the United States and to the American people from those things. And our focus, therefore, really remains on the areas of national security concern, as well as in the value space.
I think you've touched on something really important, this idea of values. And we have another question from an audience member that gets at the heart of that. And the question is, to what extent, if any, is this a contest over ideology and regime type? How will values shape the competition between the US and China? Does making the competition about values risk isolating key partners and allies, particularly in Southeast Asia, where we've seen setbacks to different democratic governance?
Well, thanks so much for the question. I think that, number one, President Biden has been very clear from his time, frankly, as vice president, as a candidate, and now as president, number one, in his deep belief in democracy, and belief that, he and we need to prove that democracy delivers. Democracy delivers here for the American people, and democracy can deliver for the world's people. And, I think that, the president has articulated a view that, certain autocracies are really trying to challenge that idea, and believe that democracies, can't deliver, and in fact that autocracy is the way of the future. And President Biden, I think, is pretty committed to proving them wrong, and to show that democracies can and will continue to write the rules of the 21st century. I think it's important, though, to note that that's distinct from a question of whether the United States is somehow saying we will only work with democracies, or that we seek to promote democracy worldwide. I think that's a different, that's a different frame than the frame that President Biden brings to the table. When he convened the Summit for Democracy last December with over 100 democracies participating, it was really about a conversation about us. How do we strengthen ourselves? How do we show that we can deliver when there is this alternative vision that is being advanced by Beijing? And I would note, again, in the statement I referenced earlier, that President Putin and President Xi articulated, that they issued on the eve of the Olympics about 10 days ago. That there was a different worldview envisioned in what they put forward than what the United States and our allies and partners has to offer. In many ways, that's really about just core principles, and some of them are as simple as sovereignty and the fact that nations get to decide their own future, and that borders can't be rewritten, redrawn by force. And the fact that that there are key principles that all countries should be able to come together to uphold, and so I think that that's very much the way in which we see this. I do think that there is an element here where values are very important, and the president has been quite clear, including in his conversations with Xi Jinping, about the importance of human rights to the American people. But I think, again, that is about a fact of who we are, and of the universal values that we believe in, while believing very strongly that we do need to work with a range of partners and allies around the world on these issues.
Thank you. Another audience question on defending against foreign intelligence operations. As you know, there's been growing concern about great power competitors like Russia and China interfering in US politics and public discourse. Is the administration taking any steps to counter this activity and other influence operations that target the United States or our allies and our partners?
Yeah, absolutely, Rollie, and it's an issue, as some may know, that I've spent a good bit of time working on, including in my time outside of government. And I think from our perspective, with respect to the PRC's malign behavior, whether it's Beijing's attempts to intimidate critics of the regime afar, what we kind of refer to in many ways as transnational repression, or its efforts to undercut our technological advantages. We believe it's critical to preserving our democratic values and economic strength, and a priority for this administration in order to address these concerns. You may have seen that the White House recently issued guidance on implementation of National Security Presidential Memorandum, what we call NSPM, our acronym, NSPM 33, which strengthens protections of U.S. government-sponsored R&D against foreign government interference and promotes transparency. We think it's really critical as well to target foreign malign influence in a way that is consistent with our democratic values and the pluralistic character of our country. And that includes protecting the rights and interests of our fellow citizens and communities that are often most vulnerable to PRC transnational harassment. And that's why, we also put a real premium on being precise in our language and in our actions, and in, constantly underscoring that this is about activities, by the PRC, by the government and the party, and, really emphasizing that it's not about, a sort of broader grouping of people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have a couple of what I would call softball questions, and one of them is, you're working in the NSC, you're in the White House, and so you're witness to history, and you've been in other administrations. So I would like to ask you a little bit about how would you characterize working in the Biden White House? If Kennedy was Camelot, Nixon was something else, what's this administration like? Just give us a feel. Well, I would say a few things about this administration. Number one, and I have the luxury of, the fact that many of the people that I work with on this NSC are colleagues who I worked with in previous NSCs or previous roles. And so, I think there is an unbelievable amount of chemistry with the team here. Many of us came in on January 20th, 2021, a little over a year ago, having sort of worked on the transition together and sort of rolled right in the door, and knew that there was no time to be lost. And, in many ways, I think this is at least an NSC that is quite focused on just getting business done. Doing so in an extraordinarily collaborative way, but in one that really welcomes debate. We have very open conversations, lots of space to sort of bat around ideas, and to put the best things forward. And so I think that there's that piece as well. President Biden, I think, also is just a real believer in America. And I think that's one of the things that makes it just so, even working on really challenging issues, one of the things that is inspiring here every day is, that he believes in America. He believes we can deal with these challenges, that we have it in ourselves, that we have to have the confidence in ourselves, that we've got to marshal the resources and just really make it happen. And, as somebody sitting in my seat who's dealing with big challenges every day, to know that there's a president who's really can do and really just believes that we can, if we muster the will, that we can do these things is also, I think super helpful and incredibly important. So not sure I can give you a good sort of bumper sticker description, but I will just say it's really inspiring to work with people with such belief and drive and vision for what we're trying to achieve. Speaking of inspiring, I think also you as do I care deeply about the future of our country and want to encourage young folks to go into government because we need good people. And we have probably on this call students and young folks, and I know they watch our videos and read our articles. What advice would you give to young folks who are thinking about going into government, or on the contrary, thinking, oh, I don't want to go into government? What would you say?
Well, to me, there is absolutely nothing that is equal to government service. The mission that we serve here. It's both the weight of the world sometimes, but also knowing that there is enormous consequence to what we get done. And I've never sort of been a part of anything like it outside of working at government. So my advice would absolutely be, please, we need the best talent. Absolutely. I think there's a few specific things that I would say, and I get lots of questions ranging from what's the best thing to major in, or should I pursue this grad school track, or should I take time off, should I do this, should I do that? And I guess I have a couple of sort of generic pieces of advice on that front, which is one, I think following your passions is really important. My career in many ways has often been a series of little accidental moves, but informed by whether something, feels like it's going to be interesting to me. It's going to be a growth opportunity. Am I going to be able to contribute to the mission in the way that I want to? And is it going to make me get excited? And here at the NSC, when we work really long hours, and it's often a little bit exhausting. It's the fact that everybody's so committed, so passionate, cares so deeply that kind of, makes you forget what those hours are like and how grueling it can be. So I think following passions, rather than trying to calculate, careers aren't linear. And so trying to say, does A lead to B lead to C, I think is often a really hard way of looking at things, but rather is this a move that I'm going to, really, I think, be performing my best and able to contribute to the mission, I think is how I would think about that kind of question. And then I think from a skill set perspective, one of the things that just continues to strike me, no matter how far along in your career you get in government, and no matter how deep of a subject matter expert you are, novel questions cross your plate every day. Things from a policy perspective that you've never really interrogated before, totally screwball questions that it's like, wow, couldn't have ever cooked this one up, right? And to that end, I think one of the most important skills that people who are interested in coming into government can acquire is critical thinking. And there's lots of different ways of acquiring those skills. But I find on a daily basis that the critical thinking skills are really the single most important, set of skills that I use constantly. That, and then communication skills, written and oral, absolutely essential to being in government. So I think if you kind of pursue those sorts of skills and follow your passions, you can really have a great government career. The last thing I will just say, and it goes back, I think, to the question of the mission, is that, I have found coming into government as somebody originally who sort of, had the, general sort of personality of keeping my work life and my personal life, separate. I have found that my greatest friends are now people who I've worked with over the years. And there's something about being in the trenches with people working on these incredibly hard challenges, especially in the national security space, where frankly, it's not like I can talk about a lot of the big things I'm wrestling with a lot of friends who don't, work in this environment, who don't have security clearances. And so, I have found the unbelievable camaraderie, the team environment is just unparalleled. So for all those reasons, I would really encourage folks to take the opportunity if they can to come in and serve.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left. So before we say goodbye to this portion of the program, Laura, I'd like to ask you, is there anything we didn't ask about that you would like to leave with us?
Well, thanks, Rollie. I think we covered a wide range of topics today, and I really appreciate all the questions. I think the last point I would just make is, the fact that the challenge we face with China, and really a key part of our China strategy recognizes that not only do we need a whole of government approach, but that a lot of the terrain where the competition plays out is on, in private sector spaces. We talked a little bit about some of the trade and economic and technology issues, obviously huge private sector components there, a lot of questions that implicate universities, state and local governments, the research community more broadly. I think that the fact of the United States and our openness and The fact that, the government doesn't control our companies in the way that China does is an enormous asset for our system. But, it also does require us to just think a little bit differently these days in the way that we communicate between the government and the private sector, for instance. We can no longer just think inside government circles about these national security issues. We really have to be communicating more broadly, bringing in private sector partners, bringing in civil society in different ways. It's an incredible part of what we're trying to achieve. And I know, I'm sure many of the people who are watching today are parts of those different communities and really play a critical role as well. And the last piece I would say on that front, we talked a little bit about congressional action and how critical it is for some of particularly the investments. And, from my perspective, we really have seen an increasing bipartisan alignment on China. And I just see that as so important to what we're trying to achieve here, in our China strategy. So it's something that we continue to reinforce and really welcome.
Thank you, Laura. And truly, we're grateful for you spending the time with us today and helping us get our new China Center launched and off to an excellent start. So we really appreciate this.